Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to do my review of WCW Starrcade 2000. Starting off the evening, we're going to go to our first match of the night. It is Evan Courageous teaming up with Jamie Noble versus 3 Count versus the Dragons. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup with all teams involved, with 3 Count keeping the pace of the match. And 3 Count ultimately hit the finish. Pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are 3 Count. Hats off to 3 Count for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Ernest Miller versus Lance Storm. I thought this was an okay matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Ernest Miller and Lance Storm, with Miller keeping the pace of the match. But Lance Storm applies his signature single leg crab on Ernest Miller. And your winner of the match by submission is Lance Storm. Hats off to Lance Storm for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Hardcore Championship. It is Terry Funk versus Crowbar. I thought it was an okay match. Back and forth matchup between Terry Funk and Crowbar, with Funk keeping the pace of the match. Funk then hits a devastating pile driver on Crowbar, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time, new WCW World Hardcore Champion, is Terry Funk. Hats off to Terry Funk for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Chronic versus Reno and Big Vito. It was an okay matchup, back and forth matchup between both teams, with Reno and Big Vito keeping the pace of the match, but this match ultimately ends in a no contest. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is an ambulance match. It is Mike Awesome versus Bam Bam Bigelow. I thought it was an okay matchup, back and forth matchup between Awesome and Bigelow, with Awesome keeping the pace of the match. And your winner of the match is Mike Awesome. Hats off to Mike Awesome for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW United States Championship. It is Shane Douglas versus Hugh Morris. It was an okay match. Back and forth matchup between Douglas and Morris, with Douglas keeping the pace of the match. But Hugh Morris ultimately gets the win in this match due to disqualification. Hats off to Hugh Morris for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a bunkhouse brawl match. It is Conan, Billy Kim, and Rey Mysterio teaming up against the Harris Brothers and Jeff Jarrett. I thought it was a decent match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with the Harris Brothers and Jarrett keeping the pace of the match. And Jarrett ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are the Harris Brothers and Jeff Jarrett. Hats off to the Harris Brothers and Jeff Jarrett for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is Kevin Nash and DDP versus The Perfect Event. I thought it was an okay match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Nash and DDP keeping the pace of the match. Nash ultimately hits his signature jackknife powerbomb, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Kevin Nash and Diamond Dallas Page. Hats off to Kevin Nash and DDP for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a no-holds-barred match. It is Lex Luger versus Goldberg. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Lex and Goldberg, with Goldberg keeping the pace of the match. Goldberg ultimately hits his signature jackhammer on Lex Luger, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match is Goldberg. Hats off to Goldberg for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Starrcade 2000. It is Sid Vicious versus Scott Steiner for the World Heavyweight Championship. I thought it was an okay matchup. Back and forth matchup between Sid Vicious and Scott Steiner, with Scott Steiner keeping the pace of the match. Steiner ultimately hits his signature Steiner recliner on Sid Vicious. Vicious taps out, and your winner of the match is Scott Steiner. Hats off to Scott Steiner for getting the win in this matchup. A couple of things I'm going to say about Starrcade 2000 before I get out of here, man. Number one, I was always a big fan of the Starrcade events. And I mentioned this multiple times in the past. Starrcade to me, and we're going all the way back from Starrcade 83. Starrcade was a synonymous event in professional wrestling. To me, for what it's worth, I think what Jim Crockett was doing with the NWA, and then, Dusty creating this event known as Starrcade. To me, WCW or NWA never had a WrestleMania type pay-per-view feel, except for Starrcade. I think Starrcade to me was WCW's WrestleMania. It was always the best event that NWA, WCW put together. for the fans. And 9 times out of 10, the match quality on that pay-per-view and the matches alone were great, were fantastic. I remember Starrcade 83, the main event was Ric Flair versus Harley Race. Harley Race was defending the NWA World Heavyweight Championship against Ric Flair with special guest referee Gene Kiniski in a steel cage match. It was a fantastic match. It was a great match. I mean, you have 3 world champions in the same ring simultaneously, and they put on a fantastic match. And it really was one of those matches that really put Ric Flair, his career, just rocketed after that match. I mean, everybody knows who Ric Flair is, 16-time world heavyweight champion. Everybody knows who Harley Race is, 7-time NWA world heavyweight champion. And just put on a fantastic match, man. And even from that match alone, the Starrcade events were always just good. Dusty versus Flair, these are just to name a couple matches that were on Starrcade. I mean, Starrcade put on fantastic matches. Now, with that being said, do I think Starrcade 2000 is in that same, argument as one of the best Starrcades? Absolutely not. I think Starrcade 2000 was atrocious, to be honest with you. And I mentioned this multiple times in my other pay-per-view reviews for WCW from 1999 leading up to 2001, that WCW was on the decline, man. WCW, the storylines were not there. The fans were definitely not there. The fans really weren't invested in the product as much as they were, let's say, in the early days of 95 when Nitro was created. The fan base just wasn't there. A lot of the fans that were, WCW originals went over to WWE. It was a better product, and they were just beating, WCW in the ratings every week. For the longest time, it was WCW beating WWE in the ratings, but, from, I would say, late 90s to early 2000, I mean, it was game over for WCW. It just wasn't there, man. The NWO wasn't there. Hogan really wasn't doing much. I mean, it was a lot of decline, if you will, for WCW. But with that being said, just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of a 10. 1 being the absolute worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give Starrcade 2000 a solid rating of a 3.5 at best. But this is my review of WCW Starrcade 2000. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.